You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. What is the meaning of life? It's a nice, easy question to get our day started off with, right? What is the meaning of life? That is probably one of the deepest questions that anyone can ever ask. It gets at the very core of our existence as human beings. And depending on who you ask, you might get very different answers to that question. You might get some people who think that the meaning of life is to climb up the corporate ladder, achieve as much as they possibly can, make a name for themselves, have some sort of lasting fame, even when they're gone. Others might say it's about getting the most pleasure out of life possible, experiencing as much as you possibly can. And others still find meaning in life in following God and religion. Though I did not grow up in a liturgical tradition at all, I was very familiar with the answer from the Westminster Catechism when I was a kid. What is the chief end of man? It is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And that was given as the once-for-all answer of the meaning of life. Today, we are going to continue our guided tour through the book of Ecclesiastes, and we're going to hear from our sage Qoheleth what he believes the meaning of life is. And his answer very well might surprise you. It is definitely not the sort of answer that you have heard in church before. So get ready. This is Ecclesiastes Chapter 2, Uncut and Unfiltered. Last week, we were introduced to the character of Qoheleth. He is the main speaker in this book of Ecclesiastes. And we learned about the beef that he has with the major wisdom traditions of the Bible, and I think you could even say, albeit a little anachronistically, with Christianity as well. Qoheleth does not believe that we are living our lives to the fullest. He thinks that we are wasting our lives, chasing after things that are impermanent or perhaps even meaningless in light of how short and confusing this life can be. So last week he tore down our assumptions and expectations in life, interrogating what we think life is supposed to be like. And now he is going to give us a little bit of an explanation, a tour of how he dealt with these problems himself. He's going to walk us through his journey of figuring out how to live the good life. That is really what Ecclesiastes is. It is a thought experiment on how to find the good life. What is the best way that I can live? What is the most that I can make out of this short lifespan that I have? So this is his guidebook, if you will. This is his saying, here are the steps I took. Here are all the different experiences and adventures that I had. And then he is going to give us his conclusion about all of that as we go through this chapter. So if we look at verse 1, he says to his heart, and this is a very common expression that we'll have throughout the book, where he has an inner dialogue with himself. And he says, come on, I will test you with mirth. In other words, let's find out if hedonism will satisfy, if I can get the most pleasure possible out of life. Will that make me happy? Will that answer the hevel, the futility, the enigma of life that I feel? So, therefore, enjoy pleasure. Literally, that reads, look upon the good. And this is the first of many references that are going to take us back to Genesis 1 through 3. Because in Genesis 1, we constantly had God saying that he saw that his creation was good. The Hebrew word is tov. And then in chapter 3, we had an inversion of that where the woman, Isha, saw what she thought was good, even though God had said not to touch it. So this is kind of like Qoheleth being in the place of God, if you will. He is looking at what he sees as good. So I feel like we're almost meant to be a little on edge here as we're looking at this and saying, well, the last time somebody saw what looked good in their own eyes, that did not turn out very well. And sure enough, Qoheleth comes to the conclusion right here in verse 1 that a life of partying is also hevel. Now, when I do these studies, I often reference the Net Bible Notes, the New English Translation Bible translation notes. And they're often very useful. I really appreciate them. I always recommend them. But this is a case where I don't really agree with what they say here, because they are saying that Hevel is meant to be an antonym with Tov. In other words, the futility, the confusion, the baffling enigma of life is the opposite of good. But I'm not sure that Qoheleth is trying to say that confusion and exhaustion are the opposite of good. Because he's saying that everything is Hevel. Everything is exhausting. Everything is confusing, really, when you get down to it. But as we're going to see in this chapter, and as we continue through the study, that doesn't mean that there aren't some good things in life. So I'm not sure that Tov and Hevel are totally separate entities that can't coexist at the same time. I think, if anything, he's trying to find a way to find Tov within Hevel. I think that's the task of this chapter. A Bible Project points out that there are three very disturbing things about the world that Qoheleth is going to discover. The first is the inevitable march of time. Second, the universality of death. And third, the randomness of life. Now, this week we will touch some on the inevitable march of time. Next week we'll deal with the universality of death, and then in some of the chapters after that, we'll deal with the randomness of life. So Qoheleth is going to show us that eventually death comes for all of us. It devours the wise, the foolish, the rich, the poor. You can't game life. You're setting yourself up for a fall. So he is going to target the ways that we find meaning and purpose in our lives, because he thinks that we're finding meaning and purpose, or at least looking for them, in things that don't really last. Verse 2 is an area that I'd kind of like to open up for discussion, so I would love to hear back from all of you on this, what your thoughts on this verse are, because I'm not sure if we're supposed to agree with Qoheleth or not here. He says, of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what does it? In other words, what's the point of it? Now, some people will point out that the word laughter in the first part is more of a mocking sort of laughter. The Hebrew word is liskok. So it's not just like joy or merriment, it's actually mocking or irony. And that may very well be the case. That is the way that that word is usually used in the Tanakh. However, we have mirth in this verse as well, and I think it's set on parallel. And the word mirth does just mean joy or merriment, being happy, laughing, having a good time. So I think that these are kind of an example of the hendiadys that Qoheleth really likes to use, where he'll have two very similar words in close proximity to each other in order to show you that he's taking up the whole of it. It's a comprehensive study. Now, if we're looking at that first mocking word, liskok, Rabbi Rami Shapiro in the Ecclesiastes Annotated and Explained noted that often the last refuge from absurdity is irony and mockery. While these may not make you feel superior to those trapped in pursuit of permanence, they do nothing to improve the way you engage impermanence. End of quote. In other words, it's often the things that we are most unsure or insecure about in our own lives that we mock in others. In many ways, Ecclesiastes is almost like a postmodern deconstruction text. It made me think of different movie genres and how over time, there are kind of cycles of which movies are popular. You know, there was a time when Westerns were very popular, a time when you had a lot of heist movies. At the time of this recording in 2024, we are now past the peak of the superhero movie craze. And what tends to happen whenever you have a cycle of a lot of movies in one particular genre is that people start to get tired of them because they start to notice the similarities that all of the stories share. And then what eventually happens is you have someone come along with a postmodern take on that movie. They deconstruct the core elements of it and often have a very meta approach, a very self-aware story where the characters know that they are in that type of movie or they make comments about that type of movie. The OG for this by far is Scream. The Scream movies are fantastic examples of postmodern horror, where you have characters within a horror movie talking about what happens to characters within a horror movie. And it was so popular and such a great series of movies that before too long you started having a bunch of other very postmodern deconstruction style horror movies like Cabin in the Woods and others that are essentially doing the exact same thing. That's kind of what I feel like Ecclesiastes is doing here, is in many ways Qoheleth is mocking other people's way of looking at life, and yet he is also saying that doesn't really get you anywhere. Like, he is aware of his own shortcomings in this. It's almost like he is a very self-aware character. And yet he's not just talking about mockery. He is criticizing happiness in and of itself. He is criticizing the pursuit of happiness, asking, is that what we really want in life? Like, what do you really think being happy is going to do? And does being happy actually make your life better than somebody else's? He asks, what does laughing actually accomplish? Now, this is where I'm not sure if we're supposed to agree with him or not, because I think today we would say laughing actually accomplishes a lot, right? I think he might even be taking shots at something like Proverbs 17:22, the old merry heart does good like a medicine sort of verse. I think he might be questioning that wisdom and saying, well, yeah, but you can have somebody who's happy all the time and they're totally ignorant of what's going on in life. They're happy because they don't know the reality of the world around them. Is it not better to know reality and be miserable than to be happy in a fake reality? It's kind of the Matrix question, the red pill, blue pill. Which one are you going to take? Are you going to be blissfully ignorant in a reality of your own making? Or are you going to step into what reality actually is and deal with all of the complexities and anxiety that that can cause? This is something that I think is really important for those of us who consider ourselves to be Christians to consider. Qoheleth is consistently chipping away at the things that religious people turn to for significance and meaning, the trite sayings that they have, the classic in right, out right, up right, down right, happy all the time attitude. And he's saying, is that actually healthy? Is it actually good to just say, oh, everything's okay because God's got it, or I'm not worried because I'm going to heaven? Like, that sounds nice. That sounds like you have no cares, no worries. But what happens then when you actually do have a real worry? Are you able to express that, or do you have to fake toxic positivity in order to fit in with a community? I think Qoheleth is aiming at that sort of thing and saying that's hevel. If you feel like you have to constantly be happy or joyful, or you can't express emotions other than a fake smile plastered on whenever you're around people in your community, that's meaningless. That's futile. That's not actually a good life. That's just pretending like you have a good life and talking about it out loud until you believe it yourself. Now, I know there are some people where their personality is just they kind of like the blissful ignorance. They don't want to know anything about the news. They don't want to know what's going on in the world. They don't want to read outside of their little circle. They are very content just staying where they are comfortable. And there's something to that. I get that. There is something to a simple life. But in this modern world that we live in, I think we have kind of gotten to a point where Qoheleth would say, you don't get to live that life without ignoring the reality around you. It used to be that you could go your entire life without knowing there were people outside of your tribe who believed differently than you. The average person didn't travel far from their home throughout most of human history. There wasn't the same spread of ideas that we have today, so you could get away with that. Today you can't. We have information all around us, and we are forced to make a choice between this ignorance that we choose in order to stay comfortable or living in reality and all of its discomfort. And I think Qoheleth is saying that as uncomfortable as that is, it's actually the better path because you're at least going to know that this is what life is like. You can at least grasp reality and not live a lie. We'll keep going with that a little bit more as we go through the chapter. For now, let's get back on his track of hedonistic pleasure. I like how Eugene Peterson in the Message Bible translated these couple of verses. He says, "What do I think of the fun-filled life? Insane! Inane! My verdict on the pursuit of happiness? Who needs it? With the help of a bottle of wine and all the wisdom I could muster, I tried my level best to penetrate the absurdity of life. I wanted to get a handle on anything useful that we mortals might do during the years that we spend on this earth. Verse 3 here was definitely not popular in the circles that I grew up in. I grew up independent fundamental Baptist, and it was a very teetotaling circle. So the thought of this main character devoting himself to finding the best wine and enjoying that, and even laying hold on folly, as the King James says, that was not popular. People did not like this verse. And as I've studied it, I have found that it apparently is not just my old circles that were uncomfortable with this. Many commentators don't like the thought that he could be wise and pursuing folly or foolishness at the same time. In fact, Robert Alter, who does a translation and commentary that I usually respect very much, looked at this particular verse, and he made the translation choice to assume that the verse was actually missing a Hebrew word lo, which means not. So he thinks that it's supposed to read, I sought in my heart to give myself to wine, yet equating my heart with wisdom, to not lay hold on folly until I could see what was good. But that's not what the text says. It's a guess, and it's possible that scribes may have accidentally left off the word not there. I understand why some translators go for that. It fits the overarching narrative of Scripture better. But we've already said Qoheleth is a unique voice here, and we have to let him speak for himself. Just because what he says sounds unorthodox does not mean that it is wrong. It is here in the text for a reason, and that's to be a different side of the diamond to look at, a different facet of theology to explore, a different perspective than what we have heard before. The Bible does not just give one perspective and say, this is what you need to believe. It gives multiple perspectives and invites us to bring our own and see what we can learn from it. Now, that's not at all how I grew up, but it's right there in the text. We have two creation narratives side by side in Genesis 1 and 2. David is introduced 2 different times in 1 Samuel. For crying out loud, we have 4 different gospels side by side, and nobody bats an eye. So this is a really common practice in the Bible to put parallel stories side by side from different perspectives so that we can get these different angles on it, and it invites us into conversation rather than doing what so many of us Christians do, and that's to pigeonhole us into points of debate. That is not the point. We're supposed to look at the difference of this text and say, wow, there is a different way of being a believer in Yahweh. There is a different way of following this wisdom tradition than what the rest of the book said. Maybe there's an alternative path to life that is okay to live because it's here in the Bible. So we can't mellow this down just because it makes us uncomfortable. We have to acknowledge that Qoheleth says, I chased after wine and was still wise. I did foolish, dumb, stupid things, but was still wise. I know some people would say, oh, you can't be both wise and do stupid things at the same time. I'm like, have you ever met a teenager? Have you ever met a college student? Have you ever met a man? We do stupid things all the time, no matter how smart we are. There's a reason that women live longer than men, and it's because of the dumb stuff that we try. But that doesn't mean that we are dumb. You can have the smartest guy in the world do dumb stuff. We all have times when we just want to break loose from convention and let our hair down and live a little. That's what Qoheleth is doing here. He's kind of like saying, don't take yourself so seriously. Lighten up. I grew up in a very stodgy tradition. Sure, they would say that they had the joy of the Lord and that they laughed, but boy, they looked miserable walking into church every week. And a lot of times it was just miserable people. Now, not everyone. There were some truly good people. But a lot of them, you just look at and you're like, this life isn't working for you. You need to find something better than this belief system because you look miserable. And in many cases, that's probably because they actually were. If you try to live out the legalistic life that so many Christians have, especially fundamentalists, you're going to be miserable because that's not the life that God intended for you. To borrow the phrase from Ferris Bueller, these sorts of people, you shove a lump of coal up their butt and in a couple weeks you got a diamond. Like, they just need to loosen up. I remember when I was in college, there was one time we had a super strict staff member, I guess you could say. Let's just say you didn't want to get on their bad side. Now, thankfully, I was on their good side from pretty early on. They really liked me. But if you were on their bad side, things were not going to go well for you. And there was one time I was sitting in the dining hall, and one of my friends made the comment, "Oh, yeah, if you tick that person off, they can beat you down until you're questioning your salvation." And it was just a stupid joke. But then we have another faculty member that's right there, gets all up in a huff about that, and it's like, "Do not joke about losing your salvation. That's awful. You can't ever lose your salvation." And I'm just like, bro, chill. It was a joke. You know, sometimes we get so uptight about these things and trying not to sin or offend God. I'm like, God knows that we're human. Now, I'm not saying that we should willy nilly go about sinning purposefully, but it's like we're so afraid of making the tiniest little slip up, as if God's up in heaven on a cloud with a thunderbolt just ready to strike us down at the first little thing we do to offend him. That's more of a Greco-Roman Zeus sort of figure than it is Yahweh. I don't think that's a healthy view of God. If anything, it represses our emotions and scares us into never actually enjoying life. That's not healthy. Speaking of not healthy, here again I disagree with the Net Bible notes, because they try to make the argument that Qoheleth, quote, did not indulge in drunkenness. Rather, he contemplated the value of self-indulgence in his mind. It was a purely mental, cognitive endeavor. He never actually gave himself over to wanton self-indulgence in wine or folly, end of quote. And here we have, again, an example of a commentator not wanting to come to grips with what it would mean if Qoheleth actually lived this kind of life. In the circles that I grew up in, it was totally anathema to drink any kind of alcohol. It was not allowed in the slightest. Like, you weren't even supposed to touch a beer bottle or really even look at it. I mean, you walk into the store and you see some beer on the aisle, you have to look the other way. So to think that Qoheleth could possibly be fully devoting himself to enjoying wine is just really scary for these people. And it kind of amuses me, because these will often be the same people who view the text very conservatively and think that Qoheleth is actually Solomon. If you really believe that this is Solomon, you don't think that this guy got drunk on some occasions? We're talking about the dude who had 1,000 wives and concubines, sex slaves. This guy had the biggest harem of all time, and you think that he was too moral to ever get drunk? Come on. You probably also think that means he only slept with one of those women in his harem each night, right? Yeah, no way. Just because the main character of a story in the Bible does something does not actually mean it's right. So even if you think that drinking and getting drunk are completely evil things, that doesn't mean that you have to agree with Qoheleth doing it. Like, David does horrible things in the Bible. Abraham does horrible things in the Bible. Pretty much every main character screws up. So why can't you admit that Qoheleth did this, whether you like it or not? That's just being dishonest to the text. I think we have to let it stand as it is. And if you disagree with his choices, that's fine. But admit that he made them. Don't hold this guy up on a pedestal just because he's the main character. And I don't know, maybe different traditions are different than mine, but at least in the one where I grew up, we kind of elevated these biblical characters to almost superhuman status. Paul was like the super Christian. We had the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11 that we would focus on. You just have these heroes that you don't ever say anything negative about. And that's dangerous because, well, for one thing, it's not true of the Bible characters, and it's not true of anyone. Eventually, it seeped out of the Bible and started affecting the culture around us too. We started treating IFB preachers as if they were these heroes of the faith too. We would have all kinds of biographies about relatively little known preachers, but treat them as if they were super Christians just because they were old IFB style preachers. That's dangerous. That's not healthy. Anyway, that's my little rant there for today. No matter what you think of the morality of Qoheleth's choices, Rabbi Rami Shapiro summarizes it well. He says, "You can deaden yourself through drink, but drunkenness isn't transformative. You can't escape the reality of impermanence." Speaking of drunkenness, verse 4 says that Qoheleth made great works. He built houses and planted vineyards. Now, vineyards should remind you of the first time that this word showed up in the Bible. And if you have listened to our Genesis 7 through 11 series, you might remember the story of Noah. Right when he got off the ark, he built a vineyard, which was a hyperlink back to Eden as well. So this is kind of now hyperlinking us to the Noah story. And as Qoheleth lists all of these great accomplishments, the things that he has built, it is very similar to an Egyptian text called the Teaching of King Amenemhet I. It reads, I made my house adorned with gold, its ceilings in lapis lazuli, its walls in silver, its floors in hard stone, its doors in copper, its bolts of bronze, made for eternity, equipped for everlasting life. I know this, as it is I who am its Lord of all. End of quote. That's very similar to this recounting that Qoheleth gives of all the things that he built and created. If this is a later text around the time of the Babylonian exile, there may even be a little bit of a dig at like the Babylonian hanging gardens and things like that. He might be saying that he made even better things than that. Verse 5 kind of continues the Eden parallel here because he says, I made me gardens and orchards. And that word that the King James translates orchard is the Hebrew word pardes. And it's a Persian loan word. It only shows up a couple times in the Tanakh. Once it gets over into Greek with the Septuagint, it becomes paradisos, which sounds really close to our English word paradise. So I think there is sort of a connection going back even to Eden here in this verse as well. In fact, Christopher Wright, in Hearing the Message of Ecclesiastes, drew on this idea to say that this is almost like an anti-Eden, because he is building gardens, but when he steps back, he sees Hevel instead of Tov. When God created, he saw Tov, but when Qoheleth creates, he sees Hevel. Really interesting thought there. In the ensuing verses, he talks about all the different things that he built and accumulated to himself. He built gardens, orchards, planted all different kinds of trees. He made aqueducts, and he got slaves, male and female, and had slaves born in his house. I think a couple translations say servant there, but yeah, those are slaves. We need to be honest about the way that worked in the ancient world. Yes, it was a little bit different than modern ideas of slavery, but they were still slaves, so I think that's worth noting. Also, I'm not quite sure why the King James went ahead and said that he had great possessions of great and small cattle. It's pretty clearly the words for cattle and sheep, so I don't know why they just said cattle. It's like great and small cattle, as if the sheep are the small cattle. That's not quite how that works. So that's a little bit of a weird translation choice there, but just about every other translation corrects that and says that there was many cattle and sheep. So just a little bit of an oddity there. Speaking of linguistic oddities, verse 8 has a really fun one. Actually, a couple. First, let's look at the word seglah. This is what the King James calls peculiar treasure of kings and of the provinces. The Net Bible here, this is actually a time that I like what they said here, so we're back to liking their commentary at this point. It says that it denotes personal property, valued property or personal treasure, particularly referring to king's silver and gold. So basically this is private property belonging to a king. Now, let's talk about a really interesting translation issue here, because I will read to you first from the King James here. This is verse 8. It says, I gathered me also silver and gold, and the peculiar treasure of kings and of the provinces. Here's where it starts getting interesting. I got me men singers and women singers, and delights of the sons of men as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. All right, on the surface, that doesn't sound too bad. Now, let's look at a couple other versions here, see what we have for Ecclesiastes 2:8. The ESV says, I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. Now remember, the King James said, I got men singers, women singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all sorts. So ESV here, rather than saying musical instruments, says many concubines. NASB, same thing, many concubines. Let's see, Good News Bible. I had all the women a man could want. All right, again, a little provocative here. New Century Version, all the women a man could ever want. Young's Literal Translation, I got the luxuries of the sons of man, a wife and wives. Let's look at the Holman Christian Study Bible. I gathered male and female singers for myself and many concubines. I've got the ISV says all sorts of mistresses. And that gives you a pretty decent summary. The LEB, the Lexham English Bible. I got a good laugh of this. I acquired for myself male and female singers, as well as the delight of men, voluptuous concubines. Whew, and releasing after Valentine's Day, too. We might need to put the little E on this episode at this point. But what in the world is going on here? Why do you have something like musical instruments in the King James? I think the New King James followed suit with that, and like one other version. And then everything else says essentially concubines. Which, by the way, concubines is a nice, fancy, clean way of saying sex slaves. So, what is going on here? Well, this is another case, unfortunately, of translators not liking what a word actually means in Ecclesiastes, and so they try to clean it up in order to make it sound more orthodox. The words in question here are two cognate words. They're essentially the same word, just in slightly different forms, and it's shida, shidot. So you can hear the similarity there, shida, shidot. Same word, just in a little bit of a different form. And there's argument over what exactly it means, because it's not really a form of any known word that is used a lot. So there's a few different options, and we have to remember, versions like the King James were written 400 years ago. So the dictionaries that they had for ancient Hebrew and Greek were significantly fewer and less refined than what we have today. We've had archaeological discoveries in the last 400 years that have given us a lot more ancient texts that allow us to understand better the full nuance of some of these rare words. It used to be that you just had to kind of guess from the context if it was a rare word of what it could mean here. But now that we have some other ancient texts, we're able to say, oh, this word actually means XYZ in that work, so maybe we can see if that meaning works here in this passage. So they were guessing as best they could. I am not sure what led them to think it was musical instruments, what route exactly they were going to from that. Interestingly enough, the Septuagint, and I think a couple other older versions, maybe one of the Aramaic ones, have it as pouring out wine. So in the old King James style, they were kind of going along with, I think, just the context of hearing about the men singers and women singers in the verse. Like, I don't think there's any word in Hebrew of Shadah that sounds similar to a musical instrument word. So I think they were just trying to look at the context and say, well, we don't really know what this is. He's talking about singers, so maybe it's a musical instrument word. You have something then like the Septuagint that says, well, he's been talking about wine, and, well, maybe since he was talking about silver and gold and treasures, maybe these are like the cups, like silver and gold cups that you could pour wine into, chalices, if you will, wine vessels. And I see where that's coming from. But if we just look at the closest, most obvious thing to the Hebrew words Shadah, Shadot that we have here, it would be the Hebrew word Shaddai, which you might recognize if you grew up listening to early 80s CCM. Thank you, Amy Grant. Many Christians hear the name El Shaddai, and they think of God Almighty. However, there's a pretty good case to be made that Shaddai does not mean Almighty. Rather, it means breasts. Now, that is a whole other discussion, what that would mean for the term God Almighty. It definitely takes that from a warrior term to very much a mother figure. Very, very fascinating. In fact, in our interview episode with Tom Ord, he got into that a little bit. It's something I would love to dive into more. We just don't have time to in this particular episode. But there is increasingly new information out there about that that's more and more accessible. So it is something that you can find some info on online. But getting back here to verse 8, the verse is literally saying then that I gathered to myself the delights of the sons of men, breasts of breasts. Unless you were homeschooled, you probably don't have to think too hard about what exactly that would mean. It's a very vulgar way for Qoheleth to refer to female sex slaves. He is describing a human female that he had in his ownership by the physical trait of her voluptuous breasts. Talk about objectifying women much, right? And this is not just something that we can write off as Qoheleth being some godless misogynist. He was existing within the Jewish tradition. He believed in God. He was a theist. He was following out what was within the bounds of the Jewish law. I believe that the Bible is a book of progress. I believe that it steps up the morality of its people from the cultures around them. But that does not mean that it sets the once for all ideal. The Torah instructed ancient Jews to treat their slaves well, but it never said not to have slaves. It said to treat your women better than other cultures, but it didn't say to remove all misogyny. And in fact, there are other portions of scripture that are just as blatantly gross, if I can say it that way, and yet put in a relatively positive light. The best example of this is in Deborah's song in Judges 5. Now, scholars will tell us this is possibly one of the oldest written portions of the entire Bible because of the language that is used there. It's a very older style of Hebrew than even the surrounding passages in Judges. But this comes after the judge, and judge is not a good English word for it. Basically, they were vigilantes. They were like Wild West cowboys that would just ride in and save the day when Israel needed them. Well, Deborah was one of those, and she led Israel in a great victory, and she sings this victory song in praise of God and how he gave them victory over their enemies. And toward the end, now mind you, this is Deborah, this is a woman singing this, she sings, "Have they not all obtained? Have they not all divided the prey? To every man," now a lot of English translations will say something like a damsel or a maiden or a girl or two. So the old King James reads, "To every man a damsel or two." But that's not what the text says. The text quite literally reads, "To every man a womb or two." Now again, this is not some godless heathen singing this. This is the representative of Yahweh God leading Israel, singing a worship song to him, and says, now that we've won, each of our men get a womb or two to themselves to enjoy. This is a praise and worship song within your Bible, degrading women down to child-carrying vaginas. Are you uncomfortable yet? I hope so. That's not okay. This is some pretty rough locker room talk that the average Christian would hopefully not say, let alone expect to be within their inspired scriptures. But this is the Bible. This is not a text made to make you comfortable. This is not a Precious Moments Bible. This is the Bible, uncut and unfiltered. We deliver on our name. We want to give you what the Bible is actually saying here, whether that makes us feel good or whether that makes us go, oh, I do not like that at all. Now, how you grapple with that is going to depend on how you view inspiration and God's hand in writing the scriptures, but however you do wrestle with it, you have to wrestle with it. And you have to come to the conclusion that the Bible is an ancient document written in an ancient context, and that is not the same thing as ours. And sometimes that will make us uncomfortable. Moving into verse 9, the Net Bible observes that there is a verbal hendiatus here, again, that a lot of translations miss. So something like the King James will say, I was great and increased more than all those before me in Jerusalem. And the Net Bible is saying, well, actually the idea is I became far greater. Like you don't need to have them side by side of I was great and increased. That's kind of the same thing. So just make it a superlative. I increased far greater. I became a more famous person than anyone ever before me. Now, it's important to realize verse 10 here. This is so easy to skip over, but I think this is a key. He says, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor. This was my portion of all my labor. This is key. We miss this because we're so focused on the seemingly negative, nihilistic outlook that we think Qoheleth has, that we miss his saying, I enjoyed this. In the tradition I grew up in, we sacrificed physical pleasures for spiritual labor. We assumed that if it made you feel good, it must be bad. If it made you feel bad, it must be good. It was this totally backwards, honestly almost sadomasochistic way of viewing life. Like to assume pain is good, pleasure is bad. We had that totally upside down thinking. If it feels too good, it must be of the devil trying to tempt you. And if it feels bad, well, that must be God trying to test you and get you ready for heaven because, hey, life on earth sucks and is hard. Well, they wouldn't say sucks. Life is hard. But we miss that that's not the message of the Bible. That's a very Gnostic belief system, which, by the way, Gnosticism was condemned as heresy in early church councils. So it's kind of funny that it's become so popular in Christianity. But Gnosticism, amongst many other things that it taught, had this dualistic belief of good and evil. The physical was evil, the spiritual was good. So it extended to everything. Anything physical must be bad, anything spiritual must be good. And that's kind of how I grew up. What we did not realize is there is no sacred secular divide in life. You can do something quote unquote spiritual, something churchy. You can go to church, give to church, read your Bible, pray, say amen, help rebuild a church building, or go on a missions trip, or fill in the blank with any of that stuff that good, nice Christians do. You can do all of that and still be an absolute horrible human being. Or you cannot do any of that and still be a great human being. Just because something is done in the name of God or religion or church does not actually make it good. Just because something was not made or done with a spiritual, churchy, religious purpose in mind does not automatically mean it was bad. Like, I had the idea growing up that even music or movies that weren't made purely for the idea of glorifying God, like it had to be from a Christian perspective, if it wasn't, it was bad. So yes, that outlawed just about all movies and music for me. But that's not the only thing that can make something good. It doesn't have to be for a churchy purpose. It doesn't always have to be utilitarian. It's this whole mindset of everything has to serve a greater purpose. That is what Ecclesiastes and Qoheleth would call hevel. You are exhausting yourself. And in fact, we'll get to this, I think it's around chapter 7 or so, when he talks about being overly righteous. It's one of my favorite passages in the book. It's hilarious to see how Christians try to weasel out of that one, but we will get there. Qoheleth is here cluing us into the conclusion that he's going to get to once we get a few more verses down. And it's that you can actually enjoy life. These things that he talks about were not entirely without some profit, or what he calls here portion, some allotment. This is the little bit that I get in life. This is the lottery that God gave me, so I might as well enjoy it. That means that all of these things that he talked about, the drinking, the women, the gold, the riches, the walks in the gardens that he created, the architecture that he built, all of these different things, they actually did make him happy a little bit. We focus so much on his talking about hevel that we miss, he says, there was actually joy in this. And that is so crucial, because hevel does not mean there is no joy. It just means that there is no lasting joy, that we can't hold on to a moment and keep it forever. Think about the most perfect moment that you've ever had. Maybe you're with loved ones, you just had a great meal, you have a good drink in your hands, you're watching the most beautiful sunset that you've ever seen, it's the perfect temperature outside. You can't keep that. You might think, man, I wish I could hold on to this moment forever. Well, you can't. 10 minutes and it's going to be gone. The sunset is already changing. The drink in your hand is already warming up. The temperature is already going down. The food is already digesting, right? The moment is passing while you're even enjoying it. And we do all sorts of things to try to keep that, to try to hold on to it. We take pictures now of everything, so much so that we're so focused on getting the right picture that we miss the moment. We're looking at the beautiful sunset through our cameras on our phones instead of actually just looking at the sunset itself. I noticed this in myself the first several times I went to concerts. I was not allowed to go to concerts in the tradition that I grew up in. I wasn't even allowed to listen to that kind of music. Now, whether or not I did, that's a different story. But hey, my mom listens to this podcast, so we're not going to get into that. Hi, Mom. Love you. I'm just joking. She actually knows about all of that now, so it's not like I'm hiding anything from her. But it is true. But once I started actually going to these concerts, I was so wrapped up in trying to hang on to the moment of, oh wow, I'm getting to see this band I really like. I was taking dozens of pictures and videos, and I would get to the end of it and I'm like, it's over. I listen to the song? Did I enjoy my favorite song, or was I just trying to catch it so that I could go back and look at it? And now that I have it on my phone and I go back and look at it, sure, it's cool and it's lasted, but it's still not quite the same. It's not the same vibe as if I had actually just enjoyed the moment when I was there. That's what Qoheleth is saying. He's saying, I tried all of these things, and they actually did bring happiness. They just didn't bring lasting happiness, because nothing can. Rami Shapiro has a great quote here in Ecclesiastes Annotated and Explained. He says, note that Qoheleth doesn't say he found no pleasure in luxury. On the contrary, his heart reveled in all of it. This is what makes Qoheleth so convincing. He is not an ascetic who takes no pleasure in life, but rather a person who found real joy in his indulgences. What Qoheleth discovers isn't that there's no joy in pleasure, but that joy is no less fleeting than everything else. One pleasure has to be replaced with another, and then another. There is no end to pleasure's pursuit, and you're just left panting in exhaustion with nothing to show for your efforts. Then he goes on to add a quote from the Gospel of Thomas, which is an apocryphal gospel. It says, this is Jesus speaking within the Gospel of Thomas. If you do not know yourselves, then you exist in poverty, and you are that poverty. Very interesting quote. That it could be a whole other study, the Gospel of Thomas and some of these sayings of Jesus that aren't in our four Gospels. But that's a whole other matter for another day. I just thought that would be appropriate to include in, because this is Qoheleth kind of saying, know yourself. Experiment, find out who you actually are and what you enjoy in life. Because if you haven't done that, you don't truly know yourself, and you are poor, even if you are the richest person alive. Continuing on with Rabbi Shapiro's comments. What is the folly and madness that Qoheleth explored? Well, he doesn't say, but we can speculate that he devoted himself to the distractions of his day. Had Qoheleth lived today, he might have surrendered himself to internet gaming, daytime soap operas, hyperbolic and vitriolic radio, or the voyeurism of reality television, Jerry Springer, and even Oprah. End quote. I love how he has to throw in there, even Oprah. But yeah, I think he's kind of got a point. Like, that would be the modern day Qoheleth, is just trying to take in everything that exists, which good luck today, right? We talked about that last week. Verse 11, he says, I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, on all the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, it was all hevel. And there's that vexation of spirit. Remember, it could mean anxiety of spirit. It could also mean chasing after wind, depending on which way you want to go with that. And there was no profit. There was no leftover. There was no remainder under the sun. Now, this isn't just labor in the sense of work he's talking about here, but rather something laborious, something anxiety-inducing. In the short book, Philosophy of Qoheleth, Joel Steele talks a little bit about the 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. I really like what he says about this. He says, in his own personal journal, Kierkegaard recorded that he was living lavishly on his inheritance as a student. He experienced feelings of boredom and futility. He attributed these feelings to his excessive pursuit of pleasure. He became so agitated with the struggle to find meaning and direction in his life that at one point he considered suicide. Through reason, he finds a solution, writing, what I really need is to come to terms with myself about what I am to do, not about what I am to know, except insomuch as knowledge must precede every act. It is a matter of understanding my destiny, of seeing what divinity actually wants me to do. What counts is to find the truth, which is true from me, to find that idea for which I will live and die. This is the traditional fundamental idea behind existential philosophy, Steele writes. Each individual is responsible for determining that which gives meaning to their life. That idea or purpose becomes the reason for their continued existence and worthy of self-sacrifice, the affirmation of a person's existence. End of quote. I think he's getting onto something here. And now it's time for Rants with Colin, the part of the episode where Colin comes out and rants about something. There's all different kinds of labels that people want to put on Qoheleth. Say he's in this sort of philosophy or that sort. You'll get people who say he was a nihilist, an absurdist, an existentialist. It just goes on and on and on. And I think existentialism does kind of fit him best, at least from what I've studied of this. I am definitely not a philosopher. That is not my area of expertise. It makes my brain hurt. But as far as I can understand, I see him as an existentialist who is trying to figure out what he himself has in life. What is his allotment? What is his divine lottery? Like, what am I best at? What niche can I serve? What hole can I fill in life to make a difference? Something that no one else is doing. And it's a very individual thing. Now, that scares some Christians because they think we're talking about relativism versus absolute truth. But I don't think that's quite the same thing here, because I agree with Steele's assessment that every single one of us has to figure out, what is my personal purpose in life? What is my personal meaning of existence? And I don't think you can boil it down to something as simplistic as like the Westminster Catechism of it's to enjoy God and please him and follow after him, and what all of these different catechisms will say. That's all well and good for theology, but in practice, we have to figure out, what am I actually here for? What are my skills? What are my desires? What are my interests? What makes me, me? And religion kind of stifles that. It tries to say, just throw everything at the church. And I think Qoheleth would argue with that. I know I would at this point in my life. We each have to experiment and discover ourselves in order to live a fulfilling life. If you just go through life trying to be what other people have said you should be, you're never going to enjoy it. You're going to be living someone else's life. You have to have periods of trial and error. You have to make mistakes in life or you won't grow. Too often as Christians, we try to protect ourselves from the slightest little sin. God draws a line here and we draw the line 50 yards back and say, well, if we go nowhere near the line, we won't fail. What we've done is we have put ourselves in a much smaller box than God ever intended, and we are limiting ourselves from being the full person that he made us to be. God is not going to zap you if you're trying to understand how he made you and you slightly cross over the line. We're so scared of going an inch over the line when that's not the way it works. We have to make mistakes in order to grow as humans. And again, I am not saying let's just flagrantly sin and do the worst possible things that we can think of as human beings. But I am saying that we need to loosen up a little bit. We need to be not as uptight, because that has put us all in smaller boxes than what God made for us. I really think that many of us are going to get to heaven and say, God, aren't you so proud of how I limited myself, of how I kept myself from drinking, dancing, movies, parties, fill in the blank with whatever the go-to sin is in your church community. And I think God's going to say, I never asked you to limit yourself like that. Now, again, I'm not saying that God is permissive in saying that we should sin, but I think he's going to go, why did you box yourself in when I gave you the whole meadow to run around in? If I gave someone a $100 Amazon gift card for, say, their birthday or Christmas or something, and they only ever spent $20 of it, and they die with $80 balance still on the card because they didn't want to be too excessive with it. They didn't want to end up buying something that actually cost $105. That would not make me happy. I would actually be a little upset that now I wasted $80 that they never spent on that. I'd be saying, I gave you $100. Why didn't you live it up? Why didn't you spend all of that $100? Why didn't you get something out of it? I think God's the same way. In fact, I think I can even back that up with one of the parables of Jesus, and that's the parable that's often called the talents. When the master gives to his servants, his stewards over the household, particular amounts of money. and he expects them to have a return on it. And one of them just hides it because he's too afraid of losing it. And he thinks the master is going to be happy that he didn't lose the money. And when the master comes back, he says, "Why did you just hide it? Why didn't you at least put it in a bank so I could get some interest off of it? You're a wicked and slothful servant," in the old King James language. And I really think that's what so many of us Christians have done, is we have taken the wonderful gifts that God has given us in the world around us and said, "Nope, I'm going to choose not to enjoy any of those because I don't want to tick off God." And God's sitting there going, "I'm the one who gave that to you to enjoy. I am not happy with you that you hid that in the dirt and just waited for me to come back." That's not good stewardship. And again, please understand, I am not advocating for a totally hedonistic, go out, party all the time, make a lot of stupid decisions kind of lifestyle. That's a stereotype. I don't know anyone who actually is going to believe or say that. So let's be mature adults here and not accuse each other of stuff that we don't actually believe just because we want a straw man argument. That's not how this works. I am not calling you to waste your life, but I am calling you to spend your life. So many of us just waste it, waiting for some greater investment to come around. We don't have much of it. Qoheleth's message is spend your life. Enjoy it while you have it. Because as we'll see in a few minutes here, he says that is actually the gift from God for you. The Good News translation has a really good way of translating these next few verses, so I want to give this to you. It reads, "Yes, I was great, greater than anyone else who had ever lived in Jerusalem. My wisdom never failed me. Anything I wanted, I got. I did not deny myself any pleasure. I was proud of everything I had worked for, and all this was my reward. But then I thought about all that I had done, how hard I had worked doing it, and I realized it didn't mean a thing. It was like chasing the wind, of no use at all. After all, a king can only do what previous kings have done. So I started thinking about what it meant to be wise, or reckless, or foolish. Oh, I know wisdom is better than foolishness, just as light is better than darkness. The wise can see where they're going, and fools cannot. But I also know that the same fate is waiting for all of us. I thought to myself, I will suffer the same fate as fools. So what have I gained from being so wise? Nothing, I answered. Not a thing. No one remembers the wise. No one remembers fools. In days to come, we will all be forgotten. We must all die, wise and foolish alike. So life came to mean nothing to me, because everything in it had brought me nothing but trouble. It had all been useless. I had been chasing the wind. Nothing that I had worked for and earned meant a thing to me, because I knew that I would have to leave it to my successor, and he might be wise, or he might be foolish. Who knows? Yet he will own everything I have worked for, everything my wisdom has earned for me in this world. You know what? It's all useless. So I came to regret that I had worked so hard. You work for something with all your wisdom, your knowledge, your skill, and then you have to leave it to someone who hasn't even had to work for it. It's useless and it isn't right. You work and worry your way through life, and what do you have to show for it? As long as you live, everything you do brings nothing but worry and a heartache. Even at night, your mind can't rest." Whew, end of quote there. That's pretty intense. But I really like the way that Good News Translation puts that down. I think it's very down to earth. And one thing I really appreciate is that in verse 13, they put what he says in quotes as if he is quoting a popular saying. So like most English translations will have Qoheleth saying in verses 13 and 14, "I saw that wisdom exceeds folly as much as light exceeds darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, the fool walks in darkness." So in other words, it's like he's saying there is actually some benefit to wisdom. But in the Good News translation, they make it as if he is quoting a popular proverb and then rejecting it, where he says, "Oh, I know people say wisdom is better than foolishness, just as light is better than darkness, but I know that the same fate actually waits for all of us." So I really like that. I think it might get at something there. Ancient Hebrew did not have punctuation, the way that we do. And honestly, neither did the ancient Greek for the New Testament. So a lot of times we're guessing at punctuation when we try to translate these. And sometimes the authors do quote other people. And that's a whole other discussion. It happens a lot in Romans. At least there's a theory that it does. And that can really change the meaning of the book when you realize that Paul might not actually be espousing some of the stuff he's saying. He's quoting people in an opposition view, and then he's actually tearing it down after that. So that's why sometimes these Bible books that get into a lot of logic can seem contradictory at times, like they're going back and forth with each other. And maybe it's because the author is quoting someone else and then following it up with their rebuttal of it. So that's a possibility here. And Good News Translation was the only one I found that drew on that. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. I also liked Shapiro's translation of verse 12. Having tested pleasure, I turned to folly and madness. Perhaps these would surpass wisdom. For this is the task of a sage, to do all that can be done, that those who follow might learn from their example. End of quote. Now, there's a bit of a difficulty in translating the end of the verse here, because it literally reads, "What the man who comes after the king? That which they have already done." Now, as you can probably tell, that is not very good English, but that is how the verse reads in Hebrew. What the man who comes after the king, that which they have already done. So there's a little bit of a debate on what exactly it means. Most translations are going to say something along the lines of, what can anyone do after a king? Like, it's just going to be the same thing that the king did. Kind of the whole idea of putting Qoheleth in Solomon's shoes. Like, if Solomon couldn't find greater meaning in these things, there ain't no chance that you can either, because you don't have the time or resources that he did. So it's kind of that idea. Like, if the king says this is the way it is, I don't have a better answer. Who am I to disagree with that, if you will? Basically almost Calvinism. And there is some possibility to that. Qoheleth does seem to be a little bit on the side of God's predetermining events, but that's a whole other argument, and we'll get into that a little more once we get to a couple of those verses that kind of lean that way. Verse 13, he says, "Then I saw that wisdom exceeds or excels folly as far as light excels over darkness." Basically, he's saying, then I saw that there is more left over from wisdom than there is from stupidity. And again, if you're taking the view that the Good News Translation had, this would be like a proverb that he's quoting, or you could see it in a more traditional way as his saying, despite all of this, despite the fact that both the wise man and the foolish man die the same, there seems to be a little something better to living a life with some wisdom than of complete stupidity. Like, he's not saying go all the way to the side where you're never living or taking chances, but he is saying there does seem to be some benefit to the red pill lifestyle, if you will. Verse 14, he says, "The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness." I think it's kind of funny that he's almost using the language of wokeness here, of saying like a wise person is going to be awake to the things going on in the world, while the fool just sleepwalks through life. Now, on a practical level, that doesn't really help anyone, because we all think we're the wise one and everybody else is the fool. You know, we're still not that far removed from COVID. And I remember when everyone was going through the whole debates about the vaccine, that people who were for it called the people who were not in favor of it sheep, and the people who were not in favor of it called the people who were sheep as well. I heard it from both sides. I'm just like, we all think we're the hero of our story. We all think we're the wise one and everyone else is stupid. So I don't know that it actually gets you very far making a statement like this, but I think what Qoheleth is trying to say is that a wise person is someone who is going to listen to the words that he says, and a fool is somebody who hears what Qoheleth says, but rejects it so that they can live in their nice, neat little bubble. I deal with this sometimes even with this podcast. We talk about the sorts of things that people don't talk about in church. We draw attention to the oddities of the Bible that often get smoothed over. And a lot of people who listen enjoy that because it's a different perspective than what they've heard their whole life. But then I have other people who listen and they're like, I don't like this. This makes me uncomfortable. I want to retreat back into the nice, neat boxes that I had for my life and my religion and faith. And I totally understand that, but I think Qoheleth is challenging it, saying that's a foolish thing to do, to be confronted with reality and retreat back into a blue pill lifestyle just because The red pill lifestyle made you uncomfortable. It's better to live in truth and have to figure out how to be happy from there than to be happy living a lie. In verse 15, Qoheleth questions the wisdom of living wisely. He says, if all of this happens both to the fool and to the wise, why am I being so wise? I love his way of thinking here, that he keeps putting himself up as the wisest person in the room. But I think he's asking a really important question. He's saying, if I'm trying to live this wise lifestyle, the nice clean cut lifestyle that everybody pats me on the back and says what a good person I am, and yet I still die and no one's really going to remember me in a couple generations, that's the exact same end as the person who takes risks and does stupid stuff. This is kind of his Elsa moment. Now, if any of you listening were parents of young children around 2013, this is a PTSD trigger warning for talking about the song Let It Go. There are support groups for you. I believe in you. You can overcome this. It's okay. But in all seriousness, I think that this kind of is wrapped up in the lyrics of that extremely overplayed song. When Elsa leaves the prim, proper, perfect life that she had, she sings that she's in a kingdom of isolation as the queen. Be the good girl you always have to be. Conceal, don't feel. Don't let them know. Well, now they know. It's time to see what I can do, to test the limits and break through. I'm free. That perfect girl is gone. Here I stand in the light of day. Let the storm rage on. I know I'm harping on this a little bit, but this is how I grew up. I grew up in independent fundamental Baptist tradition as the golden child that couldn't do any wrong. And I had to constantly be on the lookout to make sure that every little thing I was doing was not offending anybody. And I eventually had to learn this lesson of Qoheleth, and I kind of learned it because I was studying this book. It's the truth that you can be too wise, too righteous. Too much of a good thing is still too much. You can go to an extreme on either side of the spectrum. Growing up, I constantly heard about the slippery slope. But what they never told me is that if you have a mountain, there's a slope on both sides. It was always that you could unfortunately accidentally slide down the left side of the slope. You could go too progressive, too liberal, too much into the world. But they never mentioned that if you go on the far right side of the mountain, there's a slope over there as well that is a slippery slope into extreme fundamentalism. And that's where so many Christians end up, because they mean well, they don't want to offend God, but they end up not knowing themselves, not being the full person that God intended them to be, and retreating into this nice, neat little box of a life. But it's a life that doesn't please God and doesn't do anything for them, all while trying to please God, but it misses the point. Qoheleth is essentially saying, why be a fundamentalist? Why go to the extreme of being churchy, being wise, being righteous? You're going to end the exact same as the person who lives without any of that. That is Hevel. He says, in fact, there's no remembrance of the wise more than the fool. Now, King James says forever. I think we talked about this last week. It's that phrase, into the age. They don't have the same idea of eternity that we do today. So he's saying that there is no remembrance of anybody into the age. So it kind of sounds like he's thinking about end of consciousness in a way. We'll talk about this more once we get a couple chapters in, but I think a good case can be made that Qoheleth does not believe in an afterlife, or at very least he is challenging the assertion that there must be an afterlife. And I think verse 16 kind of plays into that, because if there is no remembrance of the wise more than the fool, it kind of suggests an annihilationist viewpoint, that we all just die and that's it. There's a section in that philosophy of Qoheleth work that Joel Steele did, where he compares Qoheleth's philosophy here to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It's a little bit of a lengthy quote, so I'm not going to go into that right now, but I will put it in the notes on our website so you're able to check that out if that interests you. In verse 17, Qoheleth says, "Therefore I hated life." And yes, that means exactly what it sounds like. We should not smooth over that or clean it up. If we're being honest, there are times when I think all of us just have this "I really hate my life" feeling going on. And he gives voice to that. He says, why do I hate my life? Because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous to me. And that word grievous is actually a word that has the idea of like, this is badly made. This is not a good product. So it's like he's saying that God kind of screwed up and gave us a bad deal here. The life that he gave me is a faulty product because everything is hevel, and again, we have either anxiety of spirit or chasing after wind. So I hated all of my work that I took to do under the sun because I would have to leave it to whoever comes after me. And who knows if he'll be a wise man or a fool. Yet he'll have rule over all of my work that I worked on and where I have showed myself wise under the sun. This is hevel. Now, this doesn't quite carry over as well in our modern corporate workspace, but imagine being a small business owner where you started up the business. When you get too old to run that business or you die, someone has to take it over. Maybe that would be your kid, maybe another family member, maybe someone who buys it out. But at the end of the day, no matter how well you think you know them, you don't actually know what they're going to do with your business. And everything that you worked for, they are enjoying the benefits of that without having to put in all the hard work that you did. That is baffling, enigmatic, frustrating. And that's what Qoheleth is here wrestling with. Shapiro notes, "There is nothing you can do to escape the harsh reality of hevel. Indeed, the more you seek to pile up worldly defenses against the inevitability of death and loss, the more you rob yourself of what pleasures this world has to offer." He goes on and says, "Why exhaust yourself and labor for more than you need? To leave an inheritance for your children? They might squander everything you've amassed and be no less foolish for your efforts. Don't worry about the future. Simply do what brings you meaning, purpose, and joy right now." End of quote. Bible Project kind of took that thought and said to not carry the burden of your family's destiny. It's not in your control. I think this is really important for parents to realize. You don't actually hold your family together. You don't actually rule your family as the patriarch or matriarch of it. You can't control other human beings, no matter how hard you might try. And you might impact them more than anyone else, but you can't control them. And that's because you're not supposed to. That's why you get frustrated at family gatherings, because you're trying to control other human beings. I know some people who just slave away constantly at making sure that their kids have enough and will never have to worry about stuff that they did when they were little. And that is a wonderful drive to have. That shows incredible care. But what they don't realize is that a lot of times when they're working these 50, 60-hour weeks and trying to build a better future, they're missing out on life with their kids in the moment. I think that's representative of a lot of like the boomer Gen X generations, that they wanted a better life for their kids and they really worked hard for it, but they didn't realize the little things that they were missing out on in the meantime. You know, this is the dad who is working extra hours to be able to get their kid a new Xbox, but they miss every soccer practice that they have. This is the mom who works 2 jobs in order to get a in-ground pool in the backyard, but misses out on the kids' lives while they're old enough to be in that pool enjoying it. Now, please understand, I am not saying that it is a bad thing to want better for the next generation. I think we should all be working to make the next generation's life easier. But that does not mean that we should be doing that to the expense of this current time. This current time is all we have. So let's make the most of it. And sure, you can invest a little bit in the future, but what matters most is the present. Shapiro again really nails this idea. He says, "Wisdom doesn't offer you an escape from impermanence, but rather reveals a way to navigate it. Qoheleth takes pains to make it clear that the wise and the foolish meet the same fate. That is, they all die. Wisdom doesn't guarantee you political power or financial success, and there are numerous cases where the wise suffer unjustly while the foolish seem to prosper. Yet wisdom is preferable to folly when used as a navigation tool. When you're wise, you know the nature of hevel. When you understand the nature of hevel, you cease to toil against it. When you cease all effort in opposition to impermanence, You are finally free to live wisely within the impermanence. Wisdom, then, isn't a body of fixed knowledge, but a way of investigating reality and how best to live with it. Qoheleth wants you to find wisdom and live wisely. His concern isn't with your children or your grandchildren, but with you. You cannot eat or drink for the future, and you cannot survive on the eating and drinking of the past. You have to eat when hungry and drink when thirsty, and the pleasure of doing so is yours alone. To live in opposition to this is Hevel. To seek to impose permanence and security in a world empty of both is to set yourself up for great disappointment. End quote. Wow, that is fantastic. Verse 20, let's keep moving along here. Therefore I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labor that I undertook under the sun. Quite literally, this says, so I went in a circle to despair. Verse 21, he says, there is a man whose labor is in wisdom and knowledge and equity, that's skill. Yet to a man who has not labored therein will he leave it for his portion. So in other words, you can be the wisest, most knowledgeable, most skillful person, and yet at the end of your life, somebody else is going to take over with what you did. That is Hevel, and he says a great evil. The Net Bible prefers the term misfortune or injustice there, but it is still that great evil that he is talking about. I think there is a moral component that he sees in this. Verse 23, because all his days are sorrows and his travail grief, yea, his heart takes not rest in the night. This is Hevel. Our bodies might rest, but what about our minds? Sometimes we get so anxious over these things that we never truly enjoy the moment we're in because we're worrying about the next one. We could be having the best day of our lives and we're stressing over, but what about tomorrow? Qoheleth is saying, you're missing the point. Bible Project says that wealth, career, status, pleasure, none of these actually bring lasting happiness. Think of all the stress you go through every day just to wake up too old to enjoy the fruit of all that work. Or what if you live for the weekend pleasures? Well, Monday's always going to come. That is what Hevel is. So what does Qoheleth conclude with all of this? Verse 24, let's bring it home. There is nothing better for a human than that they should eat and drink and make their soul enjoy good in their labor. This I saw that is from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who can... Good old King James says, hasten thereunto. In other words, who can enjoy life more than I? For God gives to a human who is good in his sight wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he gives travail to gather and heap up, that he can give to him who is good before God. This also is Hevel and vexation of spirit, anxiety of spirit, or chasing of wind. Quite literally, verse 24 reads, there is nothing good for a human. He should eat. That's a little stark and startling, but this is Qoheleth for you. There is nothing good for a human. He should eat, drink, and see his soul happy in his troubled life. Shapiro summarizes it, so what isn't absurd? Well, to eat simply, drink moderately, and do work that satisfies the soul. That is what reality offers us. Now, this is Qoheleth's answer to the meaning of life question. What should we do? What is our purpose here on life? What is the best thing that I could do in this short time frame that I have on earth? His answer, eat good food, drink good drinks, probably wine is what he has in mind, and enjoy your work as much as you can. And a little later on, he's going to add in there, enjoy time with friends. So he basically has a fourfold plan. Eat good food, drink good wine, hang out with people you like, and do your best to find a job that you don't totally hate. That is his answer to life. That is what he says we should be looking for in a lifetime. That is the best that a human can expect in 80 years on this planet. How does that make you feel? I realize you can't speak out to me right now, but I would actually love to hear, how does that answer to the question of life make you feel? And you can write in, you can email us, you can go on our website, you can comment on our socials. If you are listening on Spotify, I believe they have a feedback section at the end of the episode where you can actually type it in right there on your app, any feedback that you have. I would love to hear, how does this make you feel? For me, it feels kind of a mix of two things. One is it's a little underwhelming. I come to the Bible and at least the way I used to read it, I would expect this great, wise, spiritual truth, something that talks about the greatness of living for God. I would not be expecting the advice to go out to a nice restaurant with some friends and enjoy my time off. Like, that's what I should be looking for in life within the inspired sacred scriptures of the Christian faith. This is the message for a good life. It feels, at least at first, when you're not used to that, underwhelming. Very plebeian, very down to earth, almost too practical. But then the longer I've sat with it, the more it's started to feel freeing. Because so often church and religion and even family can put these expectations on you that just weigh you down. And this is a very freeing message. It separates you from all of those expectations and says you actually live your best life when you are free of expectations, when you don't expect anything more out of your life than the simple pleasure of being able to eat some good food, drink some good drinks, hang out with a few choice friends, and hopefully have a job that doesn't totally suck. If you can get those four things down, Qoheleth says you have the good life. When I first heard that, it was super jarring, almost a little frustrating to me. I'm like, this can't be true. This has to be wrong. I have to be against this somehow, and Qoheleth has to be wrong. Like, we have to correct this with the rest of the Bible. Why do we think that we have to correct Ecclesiastes with the rest of the Bible and not the rest of the Bible with Ecclesiastes? Why do we think that we can accept the verses in this book that sound orthodox enough and then reject the ones that feel uncomfortable for us? We have to sit in the dissonance of his message and be okay with a not churchy answer. In fact, I think that's what makes this such a special book is it strips away all of that religious BS and says, here's what makes a happy life. It's not going to church every week. It's not reading your Bible every morning. It's not giving to charity. It's not having a bunch of kids that go out as warriors for God. It's not seeing your favorite candidate get into the White House and change policies. No, it's enjoying a good meal with good friends on your days off. That's the good life. And remember, that's not to say that other things are bad. It's just to say that we have these massive expectations out of life. I need to be married. I need to have kids. I need to have this much money. I need to have this position in my job. I need to have this much saved in a retirement account. I need to have this kind of car. I need to have this much insurance set out. And Qoheleth is going, reel it back in. That is all anxiety inducing. That will give you a headache. Just focus on the small stuff. And from a Christian perspective, we start to think that we deserve some of those things because we behave for God. I gave to church. I went to church. I read my Bible. I prayed. I stayed pure. I did, all of these things that we check off the boxes. And yet I don't have a full-time ministry like I thought I would. I don't have a spouse. I am still living in a small apartment because I can't get a better job. I don't have good health. You fill in the blank with whatever it is. And we get pissed at life because we think I deserved more because I gave it up for God. I lived spiritually, so I should be okay physically. And I think Qoheleth really speaks into this by saying that's not a deal that God ever offered you. You're expecting him to sign on the dotted line of your expectations of if I do this for you, you will do this for me. And that's not the way that life works. Life is absurd. Life is fleeting. Life is enigmatic. Life is confusing. Life is baffling. Life is anxiety-inducing if you are trying to get all of the stuff that you want out of it. Maybe what we need to do is lower our expectations and delusions of grandeur and enjoy the simplicity that God allotted to each of us. Anything else beyond that is just a bonus. Shapiro compares this to the wisdom of a 10th century Chinese Zen master, and I am sorry if I butcher this guy's name, I'm not familiar with his work, but it appears to be Ta Su Fa Chen. And he says, when asked, when life and death have come to you, what do you do? The Zen master answered promptly, when served tea, I take tea. When served a meal, I take a meal. Shapiro goes on, as you will learn in the third chapter of Ecclesiastes, life is a series of moments, each with its own truth and rationale. The only thing to do is live them as they arise. When it's a moment to cry, cry. When the moment calls for laughter, laugh. Don't anticipate what's next or cling to what was. Just engage in what is for the moment that it is. End of quote. Bible Project carries on this logic by saying, how do you live in the midst of Hevel? You have to accept it. Accept that life is out of your control and enjoy the little things in life. Joy doesn't come if you work for it. Can I say that again? Joy doesn't come if you work for it. Joy comes from little moments that you didn't expect. This is why if you work hard to do something fun or force joy, it rarely happens. And then you just get more frustrated because happiness didn't happen. That just makes me think of the bit from Brooklyn Nine-Nine where the guy says, "Why is no one having a good time? I specifically requested it." You can't make happiness happen. Bible Project also pulled out really interesting thought here about feasting and how that is one of the most common biblical images for what we're made for. We're engaging in a mystery every time we open our mouths to eat. We're announcing our dependency on others. You didn't make the food. And even if you were the one to cook it today, you probably were not the one to grow it or raise it. Jesus used feasting to announce the kingdom of God's appearance. And our story ends with a feast in Revelation. I really like that thought. Whenever we eat, it's a reminder of our dependency on others. Verse 25 asks, who can eat or enjoy more than I can? And there is a bit of a manuscript difference where some say more than I, and others say apart from him, in which case the him would be God. So that changes the question a little bit. It could be, the Qoheleth taking on this Solomonic persona saying, who can eat or enjoy more than the great king who has all this wealth and power? Or it could be saying, who can eat or enjoy apart from God? And that flows right into verse 26, because God gives to a human who is good in his sight wisdom, knowledge, and joy. So either could work, and I think either could fit the context there. Now, verse 26 is one of those verses where Qoheleth seems to have this idea that God predestines what happens to each of us. And it's kind of a crapshoot. It's kind of just luck of the draw. It's if you made God happy, he's going to give you good stuff. If for some reason you ended up on his bad side, and not so much, you're going to be laboring in vain. And that's really easy to turn into a standard Christian message of do good and God will give good back to you. Do bad and you're going to be zapped by God. But I don't think that's the point we're supposed to take here, because he says to the sinner, now we kind of have to remove our churchy meaning of that. It's just to the one who offends, to the person on God's bad side. He gives travail, to gather, to heap up. This is hevel and anxiety of spirit. Well, Qoheleth is saying that he experiences that all along. So it's almost like Qoheleth is saying he is in this group of offenders that are on God's bad side. So it's not this nice, neat, oh, we Christians are the ones that God is pleased with and he gives us all the good stuff, and all the people who aren't Christians, well, they're on his bad side. Now, Qoheleth is one of these people who believes in God, and yet he's saying, I ended up on the bad side of this God because he gave me a rotten deal. And I think that's kind of something a lot of us can echo sometimes, where we just feel like, what did I do to take off God that my life is like this? And I think we can tell from the rest of Scripture that's not actually how God works. This sort of retributive theology where we just assume if bad things are happening, it must be because God is mad at me. In fact, Jesus said that sometimes bad things happen just because we're in a messed up world. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm thinking of the time where he came across the person who was born blind. And the disciples said, whose fault is this, his or his parents? And Jesus goes, no, neither. Sometimes the world is just messed up, and God works in the world that is messed up how it is. So I don't know that I agree with Qoheleth's theology in verse 26 here, but I definitely sympathize with it. In the Message Bible, Peterson really summarizes this well. He says, the best you can do with your life is to have a good time and get by the best you can. The way I see it, that's it. Divine fate. Whether we feast or fast, it's up to God. God may give wisdom and knowledge and joy to his favorites, but sinners are assigned a life of hard labor and end up turning their wages over to God's favorites. Nothing but smoke and spitting into the wind. End quote. Now, unfortunately, we're stopping here because this is the end of the chapter, but I think chapter 3 kind of carries this thought forward and adds more nuance to Qoheleth's assertions about the meaning of life. We'll have to get into that next week. We covered a lot this week, and I don't know about you, but I am mentally tired after this. I feel like I need to go for a walk and just stretch for a bit and not have to worry about anything, just refresh my brain. And that's totally okay. I actually recommend you do that after these episodes. It helps to kind of reset us because these are deep conversations and there's a lot to them. So I just want to close out here with 2 quotes, a little bit different, but I think both are very helpful. One is from Shapiro in his Ecclesiastes Annotated and Explained. Really sums up everything that we've been talking about. And the other is from Blaise Pascal, and it's something that Tim Mackey of Bible Project would quote when he would talk through Ecclesiastes. So let's go first with the Shapiro quote. The freedom Qoheleth offers us is freedom from ignorance and foolishness, freedom from the illusion of surety, security, and permanence, freedom from the mad drive to protect ourselves from the vicissitudes of life through the pursuit of money and possessions. He teaches us how to navigate the chaos of life without hiding behind a false sense of order, imposed either by ourselves, by nature, or by God. Qoheleth's God isn't the regulator of chaos, but the creator of it. The way of God, as Qoheleth calls reality, does not lead us out of chaos, rather into it. The way of God doesn't promise us happiness, wealth, or health in this world, and doesn't even imagine a world to come. The way of the God, the way of Qoheleth, is learning how to find joy in food, drink, work, partnership, friendship, and love. This is not a teaching you can afford to neglect. End quote. Now on to Pascal's. We are never satisfied with the present. We anticipate the future as too slow in coming, as if we can hasten its course. Or we recall the past to stop its too rapid flight. We are so unwise that we wander about in times which are not ours, and do not think of the only ones which belong to us. We are so idle that we dream of those times which are no more, and thoughtlessly overlook the one that exists. It's because the present is generally painful to us. We conceal it from our sight because it troubles us. And if it's delightful to us, we regret to see it pass by. We try to sustain it by the future and think of controlling matters which are not in our power, preparing for a time which we have no certainty of reaching. Let each one examine his thoughts, and he will find them all occupied with either the past or the future. We scarcely ever think of the present. And if we think of it, it's only to take light from it to arrange for the future. The present is never our end. The past and the present are our means. The future alone is our end. So we never live, but hope to live. And as we are always preparing to be happy, it is inevitable we should never be so. End of quote. Wow, that really gets me thinking about how much I tend to either focus on the past or the future without enjoying the present. I think our challenge this week then is to enjoy the moments that we are in, to try to live exactly where we are, not before, not after, just in the moment. Focus on the little things, the sensations that we have, without being too nostalgic for the past or too anxious for the future. Next week, we're going to carry on this conversation into chapter 3, and we will address the famous time passage. I think this is probably the most popular part of Ecclesiastes, a time to born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted, all that stuff. So we'll get into that. And we're also going to deal a good bit with God's role in all of this. It's going to flesh out some of that stuff that Qoheleth was talking about toward the end of the chapter today. What has God actually given us, and how responsible is he for the good and the bad that happens in life? And then we'll close out next week talking a bit more about eternity and what actually there is beyond this life. So it's going to be another really challenging conversation, but one I am definitely looking forward to, and I hope you are as well. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.